This presentation explores mature themes and historical folklore that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine it's the night before Christmas. You're a child tucked in your bed, listening for the faint sound of sleigh bells. But instead you hear something else. A rhythmic clanking of chains dragging on the frozen street below. Then a scratching at the window. You peek through the frosted glass and see it. A 7-foot-tall beast covered in matted black fur, with the cloven hooves of a goat and massive curling horns. In one hand it carries a bundle of birch sticks, and in the other a large empty sack. Its long pointed tongue darts out, tasting the winter air. This isn't a nightmare. For centuries, for millions of children, this was the other half of the Christmas story. This was Santa's partner. In the United States, we've sanitized Christmas. The worst thing a naughty child has to fear is a lump of coal in their stocking. A funny little warning. But we've forgotten the holiday's dark heart, the ancient tradition that new true goodness can only exist if there is a true, terrifying consequence for evil. We've forgotten the shadow that follows Saint Nicholas. We've forgotten Krampus. This creature wasn't just a scary story. He was so real, so powerful that the Catholic Church spent centuries trying to stamp him out. Fascist governments in 20th century Europe banned celebrations in his name, distributing pamphlets that called him a corrupting evil. And yet he survived. He always survives. Which leads to the one central question we have to ask. How did this Christmas devil, this child-punishing demon, become the official counterpart to the kind and gentle Saint Nicholas? What ancient pact bound a saint to a monster? The answer reveals a hidden history of Christmas itself, a history of pagan gods, clandestine rituals, and a battle for the very soul of the holiday that continues to this day. To find the origins of Krampus, you have to dig deep into the frozen soil of Europe's alpine regions, long before Christianity ever arrived. In the heart of what is now Austria, Germany, and northern Italy, ancient tribes lived by the rhythm of the seasons. And no season was more powerful, more dangerous than winter. Winter was a time of death. The sun vanished, the world froze, and malevolent spirits were believed to wander the frosted landscapes. To survive, you had to appease them. During the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, people would perform rituals to ward off this darkness. Men would dress in animal skins and carved wooden masks, taking on the appearance of wild spirits and demons. They would run through the villages making loud noises, clanging bells and cracking whips, in a ritualistic act known as a Perchtenlauf, or a spirit run. This wasn't a parade. It was a desperate attempt to scare away the evil ghosts of winter and ensure the sun would return. And at the center of this pagan chaos was a figure of immense power, the horned god of the witches. This was a pre-Christian deity of the wild, a lord of the untamed forest and the feral nature of winter. He was neither good nor evil, but a force of nature itself, chaotic, powerful, and deeply feared. When Christianity spread across Europe, it couldn't just erase these ancient traditions. They were too ingrained in the culture. So it did what it always did, it absorbed them. The church took the pagan winter festivals and rebranded them. The solstice became Christmas. The wild horned god couldn't be erased, so he was demonized. His horns, his fur, his connection to the wild, all the things the old tribes respected, were twisted into the iconography of the Christian devil. And they gave him a new name, Krampus. The name itself is a clue, likely derived from the Old German word Krampen, which means claw. He was, quite literally, the clawed one. This newly christened demon, however, proved too popular to simply banish. The people of the Alps still feared the winter spirits, and they still saw a need for a figure who embodied the wild, untamed side of the season. The church, in a stroke of genius, decided that if you can't beat them, make them join you. They couldn't get rid of the horned god, so they gave him a job. They tethered him to their own winter figurehead, Saint Nicholas. This created one of the most fascinating and bizarre partnerships in all of mythology. Saint Nicholas, the benevolent 4th century Greek bishop known for his kindness and secret gift-giving, would be the face of the new Christian holiday. He would represent order, piety, and divine reward. He would visit the homes of children on his feast day, December 6th, and give gifts of fruit, nuts, and coins to those who had been good. But the church understood that a reward is meaningless without a punishment. The threat of a lump of coal was not enough to keep the fear of God in people's hearts. They needed a darker deterrent. They needed an enforcer. So the untamable pagan god became Saint Nicholas's demonic debt collector. Krampus would travel with the saint, creating a terrifying good cop, bad cop routine for the soul of every child. While Saint Nicholas would consult his book of deeds, Krampus would lurk in the background, rattling his chains, his woven basket ready. If you were good, the saint would reward you. But if you were bad, if you were naughty, disobedient, or disrespectful, the saint would simply step aside, and you'd be left alone with Krampus. His methods were far from symbolic. The bundle of birch branches he carried, known as a rutin, wasn't for decoration. It was for swatting and whipping naughty children, a very real physical punishment meant to drive the badness out of them. For the truly wicked, the punishment was far worse. Krampus would stuff them into the sack or basket on his back and carry them away from their homes. Where he took them varies by legend. Some say he dragged them to his lair in the underworld to be tortured. Others say he simply drowned them in a frozen river or ate them for his Christmas dinner. This wasn't just a story told to scare children into behaving. It was an active, living tradition. Every year on the night of December 5th, known as Krampusnacht or Krampus Night, the terror became real. Men in villages across the Alps would dress in elaborate, horrifying Krampus costumes. These weren't cheap Halloween outfits. They were works of folk art, often passed down through generations. Hand-carved wooden masks with grotesque features, suits made of real goat or sheep skin, and heavy, clanking cowbells strapped to their waists to announce their arrival. They would roam the streets in groups, a pack of devils let loose upon the world, deliberately seeking out the homes of children who were known to be misbehaving. They were a force of communal justice, a physical manifestation of the consequences every child had been warned about all year. The tradition was clear. Saint Nicholas brings the gifts, but Krampus brings the pain. They were two halves of a whole, a perfectly balanced system of Yuletide justice that ruled the European winter for over 1,000 years. But this fragile balance between a Christian saint and a pagan demon could not last forever. The forces of modernity, reason, and political upheaval were coming, and they would soon declare a war on Krampus himself. The first front in this war wasn't a battlefield of snow and stone, but a battlefield of the mind. It was the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment, a time when the flickering candle of reason threatened to burn away the ancient shadows of superstition. Philosophers and scientists were mapping the heavens, codifying the laws of nature, and arguing that humanity could be perfected through logic and education. And in this brave new world of order and intellect, what place was there for a shaggy, cloven-hoofed demon who kidnaps children in a wicker basket? To the enlightened mind, Krampus wasn't just a folk tale. He was a symptom of a disease. He represented the chaos of the old world, the primal, the irrational, the terrifying unknown that they were so desperate to conquer. The first institution to turn on him was the one that had, for centuries, been his uneasy ally, the Church. The same Catholic priests who once saw Krampus as a useful, devilish stand-in to scare their flock into piety now saw him as a dangerous liability. He was a blatant, undeniable link to the pagan past they had worked so hard to erase. His horns, his fur, his association with the winter solstice, it was all too heathen, too wild. The Church began a campaign to sanitize Christmas, to scrub it clean of its dark, pre-Christian roots. Krampus was condemned from the pulpit as a devilish mockery of true faith. Parents were discouraged from telling their children the old stories. The message was clear. The season of Christ's birth was no place for a demon. But the Church was only one front. The true hammer blow came from the state. In the mid-18th century, the powerful Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, a devout Catholic but also a ruler obsessed with modernization and control, took aim at the tradition. To her and her court, the Krampuslauf, the Krampus Run, was not a cherished cultural event. It was a public menace. You have to understand what these events were truly like. This wasn't a sanitized parade with a few actors in costumes. This was organized chaos. On the night of December 5th, the eve of St. Nicholas Day, the village square would plunge into darkness. Then you'd hear it, the distant, clanging toll of cowbells growing closer, louder, more frantic. Out of the darkness, figures would emerge, not just one Krampus but dozens. Men, fueled by schnapps and tradition, transformed into a horde of monsters. Their faces were hidden behind grotesque, hand-carved wooden masks with leering fangs and massive horns. Their bodies were draped in heavy, rank-smelling skins of goat or sheep. They brandished bundles of birch switches and dragged rusty chains that scraped and sparked against the cobblestones. They were a terrifying primal force unleashed upon the community. They would chase people through the streets, whipping at their legs with the birch branches, roaring and grunting, their bells creating a deafening cacophony. It was a night of sanctioned terror, a ritualistic release of all the darkness and fear of the long winter. To Empress Maria Theresa, this was anarchy. It was the behavior of uncivilized peasants, a threat to public order and a stain on the reputation of her modernizing empire. And so the decrees went out. The Krampuslauf was banned. The wearing of Krampus masks was forbidden. The state declared war on its own folklore. Police were ordered to break up the runs and arrest the monsters. For the first time in centuries, the winter demon was an outlaw. But how do you kill an idea? How do you ban a tradition that lives in the hearts of people in isolated mountain valleys? You can't. Krampus didn't die. He went into hiding. The tradition retreated from the cities and the public squares into the remote corners of the Alps. It became a secret, an act of defiance. In tiny snowbound villages, away from the watchful eyes of the government, the bells still rang. The masks were still carved in secret. The demon still ran in the dead of night. By trying to destroy him, the authorities had inadvertently made him something more. A symbol of cultural identity, a rebellious spirit who refused to be tamed by the modern world. As the 19th century progressed, the official ban softened, but a new and perhaps more insidious threat emerged. The war on Krampus shifted from outright prohibition to gradual assimilation. The Industrial Revolution was churning, cities were swelling, and a new urban middle class was rising. They looked back on the old folk traditions with a kind of detached, romantic nostalgia. They weren't afraid of Krampus anymore. They thought he was charming, quaint, and this led to one of the strangest chapters in the demon's history: the rise of the Krampuskarten, greeting cards. Starting in the 1890s, it became a massive trend across Austria, Germany, and Hungary to send Christmas cards featuring Krampus. The official slogan was Grüß vom Krampus, greetings from Krampus. But these weren't your typical holiday cards. They were bizarre, surreal, and often darkly hilarious windows into the changing perception of the Christmas devil. On one card, you might see a dapper-looking Krampus, almost gentlemanly, leading a group of crying children away in chains. On another, he's stuffing a terrified, flailing child headfirst into his basket. Many cards had a strange, romantic, and even flirtatious undertone. You'd see Krampus grabbing beautifully dressed, blushing women, who seemed both horrified and thrilled. He'd be seen peering into a window at a sleeping maiden, his long pointed tongue lolling out in anticipation. He was a monster, yes, but he was becoming a cartoon monster. A bogeyman who was more mischievous than malevolent. This commercialization did what government bans and church condemnations could not. It began to rob Krampus of his genuine terror. The creature that once represented the untamed, primal fear of the winter wilderness was now a quirky image on a piece of paper, a holiday gag. He was being defanged, declawed, and turned into a product. The wild demon of the Alps was being domesticated, packaged for mass consumption. For a creature born of shadow and fear, this was a fate worse than death. It was the threat of becoming irrelevant. It seemed as though the forces of modernity had finally won. They hadn't killed Krampus, but they had neutered him, turning him into a harmless piece of festive kitsch. The raw pagan power was fading, replaced by a cheap, commercialized thrill. But the 20th century was dawning, and the political landscape of Europe was darkening in ways no one could have imagined. New, brutal ideologies were on the rise, particularly in Austria and Germany. These movements had their own ideas about folklore, about ancient traditions, and about the symbols of national strength. They weren't interested in a tame, funny Krampus on a greeting card. They were looking for a symbol of power, of punishment, of purity enforced through fear. And as they scoured the past for symbols to twist to their own dark purposes, their eyes fell upon the horned, menacing figure of the Alps. The war for Krampus's soul was far from over. In fact, its most terrifying battle was just about to begin. The 1930s. A shadow was falling over Europe, a creeping darkness that had little to do with pagan spirits or ancient gods. This was a modern man-made evil, one that wore a uniform and preached a gospel of order, purity, and national identity. In Austria, this took the form of the Austrofascist movement, a regime that, under the banner of the Christian Social Party and the Fatherland Front, sought to forge a new nation, cleansed of all that it deemed degenerate, chaotic, or impure. And in their quest for a sanitized, state-approved culture, They found a perfect enemy, a perfect scapegoat. He was hairy, horned, and utterly uncontrollable. He was Krampus. To the fascists, Krampus wasn't just a harmless folk tradition. He was a symbol of everything they despised. He was disorder. He was the unruly mob, the primal, untamed spirit of the rural peasants they sought to control. He was, in their eyes, a social sickness. Propaganda of the era is chillingly clear on this. Pamphlets funded by the government began to circulate, denouncing Krampus as an evil man and a creation of the devil. They argued that this terrifying figure had no place in a modern, civilized Christian nation. Christmas was to be a time of quiet reflection, of family, of the gentle Christ child and the benevolent Saint Nicholas. It was not a time for demonic creatures to be roaming the streets, whipping children and rattling chains. This was more than just a preference. It was a declaration of cultural war. The Austro-fascist regime saw the Krampus tradition, with its raucous parades and terrifying home invasions, as a direct threat to their vision of an orderly society. Even worse, they began to associate the figure with their political enemies, the Social Democrats. They painted Krampus as a tool of the left, a symbol of anti-religious proletarian rabble-rousing. It was a masterful, if terrifying, piece of political jujitsu. They took a centuries-old folk creature and branded him a socialist agitator. The horned beast of the Alps was now an enemy of the state. The campaign was systematic. They tried to replace him. They promoted sanitized alternatives like the Belsnickel or Connect Ruprecht, more subdued, human-like companions to St. Nicholas who were less demonic. They encouraged parents to abandon the barbaric tradition and embrace a more refined Christmas. The government pushed a vision of Christmas that was bright, clean, and above all under control. Krampus, the embodiment of wild, chaotic, and frankly dirty energy, was the antithesis of this vision. He was the mud on their polished boots, the darkness encroaching on their pristine, nationalistic light. And then in 1938, the darkness deepened. The boots of the Third Reich marched into Austria, and the country was annexed into Nazi Germany. What had been a campaign of cultural suppression under the Austro-fascists now became a matter of racial and ideological purity under the Nazis. The Nazis had a notoriously complex and hypocritical relationship with paganism. On one hand, they glorified a mythical, pure Aryan Germanic past. On the other, they viciously suppressed any actual folk traditions that didn't fit their meticulously crafted narrative. And Krampus absolutely did not fit. He was not a noble Germanic god. He was a grotesque, half-animal hybrid. He was Slavic. He was Alpine. He was racially impure, a product of the very cultural mixing the Nazis sought to eradicate. To them, he was a degenerate creature, a stain on the master race's cultural landscape. The Nazi propaganda machine, already an expert in demonization, simply added Krampus to its list of undesirables. He was now officially labeled as a corrupting influence, a dangerous holdover from a lesser time, and his celebrations were formally banned. The message was unequivocal. Participating in a Krampuslauf, a Krampus run, was not just frowned upon. It was an act of defiance against the Reich itself. The Gestapo had bigger concerns, of course, but local authorities and party loyalists were more than happy to enforce the ban. Men who had for generations carved the intricate, terrifying masks and donned the heavy goat hides were now criminals. The sound of bells and chains, once a harbinger of wintry judgment, now risked bringing a very different and far more real terror to your door. This should have been the end. How could a folk tradition survive the coordinated assault of not one, but two totalitarian regimes? How could a mythical creature stand against the full might of a modern fascist state? It should have faded away, a curious footnote in the anthropological record, another cultural casualty of a brutal war. But they underestimated the people of the Alps, and they vastly underestimated the power of the monster they were trying to kill. Because by trying to destroy Krampus, the fascists and the Nazis gave him a new, unexpected power. They transformed him. He was no longer just a punisher of naughty children. He became a symbol of resistance. He became a rebel. The tradition didn't die. It went underground, in secluded mountain valleys, far from the watchful eyes of the party officials in Vienna or Berlin. The rituals continued in secret. A quiet rattling of chains in a secluded barn, a quickly carved mask, hidden away in the attic. Fathers would whisper the old stories to their children, not just as a Christmas tale, but as an act of cultural preservation, a refusal to let their identity be erased. To put on the Krampus costume, even in the privacy of one's own village, was a small but potent act of rebellion. It was a way of saying, "You do not own our culture. You do not own our history. You do not own our fears." Imagine the scene. A small alpine village blanketed in snow, suffocating under Nazi rule. Every public expression is controlled. Every word is monitored. But on the night of December 5th, a handful of men, risking arrest or worse, gather in secret. They pull on the shaggy pelts, tie the heavy bells around their waists, and lift the horned masks to their faces. For a few precious, terrifying hours, they are not subjugated citizens of the Reich. They are Krampus. They are the wild, untamable spirit of the mountains, a force that no dictator could truly conquer. They weren't just scaring children anymore. They were defying the very monsters who were trying to terrorize the entire world. The irony is staggering. A creature literally called the Christmas Devil, a being meant to embody fear, became a beacon of defiance against one of the most evil regimes in human history. The Nazis wanted to control everything, to purify everything, to sand down the rough edges of humanity into a smooth, uniform, obedient mass. Krampus was the ultimate rough edge. He was chaos incarnate, a hairy, horned, cloven-hoofed refusal to be civilized, to be sanitized, to be controlled. The war would eventually end. The Third Reich would fall, leaving a continent in ruins and a deep scar on the human psyche. And as the people of Austria and southern Germany began to rebuild, as they began the slow, painful process of digging out from the rubble of fascism, they also began to reclaim the parts of their culture that had been stolen from them. They looked to the mountains, to the old traditions that had been forced into the shadows. And from those shadows, a familiar figure emerged, shaking the dust and grime of suppression from his shaggy coat. He had survived. The chains were still there, the birch branches were still ready. Krampus had outlasted the tyrants. But his journey back into the light would be a complicated one, and would lead him to a place that no one, least of all the alpine villagers who kept his spirit alive, could have ever predicted. The New World. America. A land built on fresh starts and reinvention. A place where old-world traditions would either be transformed or forgotten entirely. For Krampus, it would be both. But first, he had to survive the 19th century. In the wake of the Enlightenment and the failed attempts to stamp him out, Krampus returned to his roots. He was a creature of the village, a terrifying thrill that belonged to the folk. He wasn't a god to be worshipped or a demon to be exorcised. He was a vital part of the winter season, as real and as anticipated as the first heavy snow. The annual Krampuslau for Krampus Run became more entrenched than ever. Young men, fueled by schnapps and tradition, would don the terrifying masks and furs. They'd strap heavy, clanging cowbells to their waists, creating a deafening cacophony as they rampaged through the village streets, swinging their birch switches at shrieking onlookers. It was street theater at its most primal, a release valve for the anxieties of a long, dark winter. It was a community ritual that bound people together through shared fear and laughter. And then something happened that changed everything. A technological and cultural revolution that would take Krampus out of the isolated alpine valleys and send his image all over the world. The postcard. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was seized by a postcard craze. And one of the most popular subjects, bizarrely enough, was Krampus. Suddenly, his terrifying form was no longer confined to fleeting firelit glimpses in a village square. He was now immortalized on cheap, transportable pieces of cardstock, sent with holiday greetings. These weren't your typical season's greetings cards. They were glorious, surreal, and often deeply disturbing little works of art. The slogan on them was Gruß vom Krampus, greetings from Krampus. Imagine receiving one of these in the mail. On one card, you might see Krampus depicted as a dapper, almost gentlemanly devil, tipping his hat while casually stuffing a crying child into the basket on his back. On another, he's a monstrous, slavering beast with a tongue that lolls down to his waist, dragging a half-dozen children behind him in chains. Some cards were darkly humorous, showing Krampus trying to woo a beautiful woman, only to be rejected because of his cloven hooves and horns. Others were pure nightmare fuel. Krampus looming over a child's bed, his claws outstretched. Krampus peering into a window at a family gathered around their tree. Krampus whipping children who had failed their school lessons. He was shown punishing children for any number of minor sins: thumb-sucking, crying, not eating their dinner. He was the ultimate enforcer of domestic order. These postcards exploded in popularity. They were a sensation. They codified his image. The horns, the dark fur, the long tongue, the basket, the chains, the bundle of birch sticks. This became the definitive Krampus. He was no longer just a regional folk legend. He was a pop culture icon of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His image was spreading, and as his image spread, so did the people who carried his story. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw one of the largest waves of human migration in history, as millions of Europeans, including countless Germans and Austrians from the Alpine regions, packed their meager belongings and set sail for the promise of America. They brought with them their languages, their food, their music, and their traditions. They brought their Christmas trees, their carols, and in the deep recesses of their cultural memory, they brought Krampus. But America was not the Alps. The New World was forging a new kind of Christmas, one that was becoming increasingly commercialized, sentimental, and most importantly, child-centric. And the vision of the American Christmas was being shaped by one man more than any other: Santa Claus. But this wasn't St. Nicholas, the stern, bishop-like figure of European tradition who traveled with a dark companion. This was a new, uniquely American creation. The transformation had begun in 1823 with the publication of a poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, better known today as "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." The poem described St. Nick not as a formidable saint, but as a jolly old elf, with a round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was cheerful, magical, and crucially, he worked alone. There was no mention of a dark servant, no hint of a switch for naughty children. This Santa Claus didn't punish, he only rewarded. The worst a bad child could expect was a lump of coal in their stocking. A far cry from being beaten with sticks and hauled off to a lair in a wicker basket. This jolly, grandfatherly image was then solidified in the popular imagination by the illustrations of cartoonist Thomas Nast in the 1860s and 70s. Nast gave Santa his North Pole workshop, his list of naughty and nice children, and his iconic red suit. By the turn of the century, this American Santa was becoming the global standard, exported around the world through advertising and media. He was friendly, he was safe, he was good for business. He was everything Krampus was not. So when German and Austrian immigrants arrived in cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, they found a Christmas culture that had no room for their horned holiday devil. Imagine trying to explain Krampus to your new American neighbors. You'd tell them about a hairy, cloven-hoofed monster who accompanies St. Nicholas, and whose job is to beat wicked children with branches and then kidnap them. They would look at you in horror. In a country that was trying to build a unified national identity, such a grim, violent, and overtly pagan-looking figure was seen as alien, barbaric, and deeply un-American. It didn't fit the cozy, family-friendly brand that Christmas was becoming. The pressure to assimilate was immense. Immigrant families wanted their children to fit in, to be American, so they began to edit their own traditions. The Christmas tree, another German import, was a huge success. It was beautiful, festive, and fit perfectly into the new domestic ideal of the holiday. But Krampus? He was quietly left behind. The stories told to the children began to soften. The threat of Krampus was replaced with the milder threat of Santa's lump of coal. Within a generation or two, the memory began to fade. The name Krampus became a half-remembered whisper from a grandparent, a confusing relic of an older, darker time that didn't make sense in the bright, optimistic world of America. While his likeness was being celebrated and spread on postcards throughout his homeland, in America, Krampus was effectively erased from the holiday. He had crossed the Atlantic, but he had lost his power, his purpose, and his name. He was a cultural ghost, haunting the edges of a holiday that no longer had any place for him. For nearly a century, Krampus would lie dormant in the American consciousness, a forgotten monster from a forgotten time. The Christmas devil had been defeated, not by the church or by the state, but by the cheerful, commercialized, and relentlessly optimistic spirit of the American Christmas. But the old ways have a habit of lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. And as the 20th century wore on, a new kind of media was taking shape, one that would find an insatiable appetite for the dark, the strange, and the monstrous. Krampus's long American winter was about to come to a shocking and explosive end. For decades, Krampus was a ghost, a forgotten whisper in the American cultural consciousness. But ghosts have a way of finding new houses to haunt. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, The perfect haunted house was being built. The internet. Suddenly, the world got a lot smaller. Niche interests that were once isolated in small towns or specific regions could now connect, share, and grow into global communities. If you were into collecting 19th century taxidermy or restoring vintage arcade machines, you could find your people. And if you were looking for something darker, to spice up the holidays, the web was waiting. But an idea, even a terrifying one, needs a champion. It needs a catalyst. For Krampus, that catalyst was a man named Monty Beecham. Beecham wasn't an ancient folklorist or a European historian. He was a graphic designer and an art director with a ravenous appetite for strange, forgotten, and outsider art. He was a cultural archaeologist, digging through the dusty flea markets and forgotten archives of the past, looking for visual gold. And in the early 2000s, he struck the motherlode. He stumbled upon them completely by accident, a collection of antique European postcards. But these weren't your typical holiday cards with rosy-cheeked Santas and snowy village scenes. These were monstrous. They depicted a horrifying horned beast with a long slithering tongue, gleefully stuffing screaming children into a wicker basket on his back. He was shown dragging kids away in chains, brandishing bundles of birch rods, and looming menacingly over terrified families. The captions on these cards read, "Grüß vom Krampus," greetings from Krampus. For Beecham, it was like discovering a lost Beatles album. Here was this incredibly rich, visually stunning, and utterly terrifying piece of Christmas folklore that was almost completely unknown in the United States. He became obsessed. He began collecting these Krampuskarten, these Krampus cards, hoarding hundreds of them, each one more bizarre and fascinating than the last. He realized he was looking at a fully formed alternate Christmas mythology, a dark twin to the Santa Claus story we all knew. In 2004, he unleashed his discovery upon the world. He published a book of his collection, initially titled The Devil in Design. It was a small-run art book, a niche publication for people interested in graphic design and bizarre ephemera. But it was a spark. For the first time, a wide American audience could see Krampus, not as a dry academic footnote, but as a vibrant, terrifying, and sometimes darkly comical character, rendered in stunning full-color lithography. The images were irresistible. They were shocking, funny, and deeply weird. And the internet, which runs on shocking, funny, and weird images, took notice. These 100-year-old postcards started to spread like wildfire across blogs, forums, and nascent social media sites. People who had grown tired of the relentless, saccharine sweetness of the American Christmas suddenly had an icon. Krampus was the punk rock answer to Mariah Carey. He was the shot of black coffee after a month-long diet of sugar cookies and eggnog. He was everything the modern, commercialized Christmas wasn't. Dangerous, unpredictable, and authentic. Beecham followed up with a more focused book in 2010, Krampus, The Devil of Christmas, which further cemented the creature's visual identity in the American mind. This wasn't just a monster, it was a brand with a century of incredible, ready-made marketing material. Artists started creating new Krampus art. Writers started crafting new Krampus stories. He became a mascot for the counterculture Christmas. But for Krampus to truly arrive, he had to step out of the postcards and into the real world. And he did. In the late 2000s, inspired by the traditional Krampuslauf events in Austria, Americans decided to host their own. In cities like Philadelphia and Portland, people began dressing up. They crafted elaborate, terrifying costumes with hand-carved wooden masks, real animal fur, and heavy, clanking chains and bells. These weren't cheap Halloween costumes. They were works of folk art, channeling that ancient alpine spirit. The first American Krampus parades were born. Imagine it. You're out doing your Christmas shopping, surrounded by twinkling lights and cheerful carols, and suddenly, you hear it. A distant, discordant clanging of bells. The sound gets louder, more chaotic. And then, rounding the corner, comes a horde of hairy, horned devils, snarling and stomping through the streets, rattling their chains and swatting at laughing onlookers with bundles of sticks. It was a glorious, terrifying spectacle. It was a reclamation of the holiday's darker, wilder pagan roots. This is the key to understanding Krampus's explosive American comeback. We didn't just import a monster. We filled a void we didn't even know we had. For generations, the American Christmas story has been a one-sided affair. It's all about rewards. Be good, you get presents. The worst that can happen is you get a lump of coal, which is more of a punchline than a punishment. The character of Santa Claus, especially after the famous "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus" editorial and the iconic Coca-Cola ads, was scrubbed clean of any intimidating features. He became a universally benevolent, grandfatherly figure. He sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake. But what's he going to do about it? Give you slightly fewer toys? There was no real threat. No consequence. Krampus brought consequence back. He restored the balance. He was the shadow that gave Santa's light meaning. He represented the primal fear and the visceral thrill that had been bleached out of the modern holiday. In a world of participation trophies and gentle corrections, Krampus was a throwback to a time when actions had real, tangible, and sometimes terrifying repercussions. He reminded us that the world contains both darkness and light, and that the holiday season was originally about surviving the deepest, darkest part of the year, not just shopping through it. People weren't just drawn to the horror, they were drawn to the catharsis. The Krampus parades weren't just about scaring people, they were celebrations. They were loud, raucous, and joyful in a way that a polite office Christmas party could never be. It was a chance to literally and figuratively let your demons out and dance with them in the street. From a few forgotten postcards in a designer's collection, to a few niche art books, to a viral internet sensation, to real-world parades in major American cities, Krampus's return was a grassroots phenomenon. It was a cultural insurgency bubbling up from below, but it was still largely confined to the counterculture. It was the domain of artists, goths, metalheads, and people who proudly put a spooky spin on every holiday. For Krampus to complete his conquest of America, he had to break out of the subculture and storm the gates of the mainstream. He had to get on television, and a certain mid-level paper company in Scranton, Pennsylvania, was about to give him his big break. It was December 6, 2012. In the fictional world of Scranton, Pennsylvania, the employees of the Dunder Mifflin Paper Company were gathered for their annual Christmas party. But this year was different. Instead of the usual Secret Santa or Yankee swap, the party was being run by Dwight Schrute, the office's eccentric beet farmer and resident expert on all things Germanic. He wasn't dressed as Santa. He was dressed in furs and a long beard, carrying a switch of branches. He called himself Belsnickel, a figure from German folklore who judges whether children are impish or admirable. As the awkward office festivities unfolded, Dwight explained the traditions of a proper Pennsylvania Dutch Christmas. He mentioned that Belsnickel was a companion of St. Nicholas, but he warned if the children were naughty, they wouldn't just get coal. They would get a visit from his dark counterpart. And then he said the name. He told his bewildered co-workers about a hairy, horned demon who stuffs wicked children into a sack, carries them down to the underworld, and feasts on them. He was talking, of course, about Krampus. For millions of Americans watching at home, this was the first time they had ever heard that name. It was a throwaway line in a sitcom, a piece of bizarre trivia from the show's weirdest character. But it was a cultural seed, planted in the most fertile ground imaginable, primetime network television. The show was The Office, one of the most popular and beloved comedies of its generation. And in that moment, Krampus wasn't just a scary story Dwight was telling to a terrified Kevin Malone. He was being introduced to mainstream America. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated cultural injection. The writers of The Office didn't just pull the name out of a hat. They tapped into that same growing undercurrent of fascination that was fueling Krampus laughs in online forums. They saw the potential in this strange, dark figure, but the way they presented him was absolute genius. They filtered him through the character of Dwight Schrute. This was critical. It made the concept safe. It wasn't a real demon being discussed. It was just another of Dwight's bizarre, old-world obsessions. The audience could laugh at the idea, because they were laughing at Dwight's delivery, at Jim's reaction, at the sheer absurdity of bringing up a child-eating demon at an office Christmas party. The show took a genuinely terrifying folk legend and domesticated him. They turned him into a punchline, and in doing so, they made him accessible. He was no longer some obscure, frightening creature from the alpine forests. He was now a pop culture reference, a piece of trivia you could share at your own Christmas party. The episode, titled Dwight Christmas, acted as a Trojan horse. People tuned in for the familiar comfort of their favorite sitcom, and they left with the name Krampus rattling around in their brains. The immediate effect was explosive. You can track it in real time. If you look at Google search data for the term Krampus in the United States, you see a relatively low flat line for years. It's a niche interest. But on the night of December 6, 2012, and in the days that followed, that line shoots up like a rocket. It was a national moment of collective discovery. Millions of people all at once were typing the same strange word into their search bars, asking the same question. Who is Krampus? What they found were the very images and stories we've been talking about. The gruesome postcards, the terrifying Krampuslauf videos, the dark folklore. But now it all had a new context. It was that thing from The Office. This connection provided a safe entry point into a world that might have otherwise seemed too morbid or strange. It was the pop culture seal of approval. And once the seal was broken, the floodgates opened. Krampus began to appear everywhere. He was no longer confined to the horror genre or subculture websites. Other television shows, seeing the success of the reference, started to follow suit. Supernatural featured him in an episode. American Dad had a Krampus-themed Christmas special. The animated show Grimm based a creature on him. He became a go-to character for any show wanting to do a dark or edgy Christmas episode. He was a reliable way to subvert holiday expectations. But the real change happened in the marketplace. The Dwight Christmas episode proved there was a massive untapped audience for this character. And where there's an audience, there's money to be made. Suddenly, Krampus merchandise exploded. You could buy ugly Christmas sweaters with his demonic face on them. There were Krampus coffee mugs, Krampus tree ornaments, Krampus-themed greeting cards that cheekily warned friends to be good. He became the unofficial mascot for a growing cultural sentiment, Christmas fatigue. For a generation raised on the internet, steeped in irony and cynicism, the relentless saccharine sweetness of the traditional American Christmas was starting to feel a little stale. People were tired of the same cheesy songs, the same predictable movies, the same forced cheer. They were looking for something different, something with a little more bite. Krampus was the perfect antidote. He was the yin to Santa's yang. He was the darkness that made the light more interesting. He represented a more honest, more balanced view of the holiday. He acknowledged that the season wasn't just about joy and gifts. It was also about reflection, about consequences, about facing the darker parts of the year and of ourselves. He gave people permission to enjoy the holidays on their own terms, even if those terms were a little morbid and a little weird. He became the patron saint of the alternative Christmas. Think about it. Before The Office, if you wore a sweater with a horned demon on it to a Christmas party, you'd probably get some strange looks. After The Office, you'd get a high five and someone would say, "Awesome! Is that Belsnickel?" The show had provided the cultural Rosetta Stone, the key to translating this strange, ancient figure into a language that modern America could understand and, more importantly, consume. But for all its impact, the television version of Krampus was still a watered-down imitation. It was Dwight Schrute in a costume. It was an animated character in a cartoon. It was Krampus as a concept, a joke, a reference. He had successfully infiltrated the mainstream, but he had done so by sacrificing much of his terrifying power. He was popular, but he wasn't feared. He was a meme, not a monster. For Krampus to complete his journey, for him to truly reclaim his horrifying throne in the American imagination, he had to shed his comedic skin. He needed to be more than just a punchline delivered by a paper salesman. He had to stop being a reference and start being the main event. The small screen had made him famous, but it would take the big screen to make him a legend. Krampus was heading to Hollywood. The leap from cult curiosity to Hollywood headliner is a dangerous one. It's a graveyard of forgotten characters and failed franchises. For every Batman, there are 100 Green Hornets. For every Godzilla, 1,000 Gorgos. The risk is immense. You take a character beloved by a niche audience, a figure steeped in centuries of specific cultural tradition, and you try to sell it to a global audience that thinks Christmas is exclusively about hot cocoa and Mariah Carey. How do you take a creature from a postcard and put him on a 50-foot screen without losing the very soul that made him special? How do you make a monster for everyone without making him a monster for no one? This was the challenge. And in 2015, director Michael Dougherty decided he was the man to meet it. Now, if you're a horror fan, that name means something. Dougherty was the mastermind behind the 2007 cult classic Trick or Treat, arguably the greatest Halloween anthology film ever made. He was a filmmaker who didn't just love monsters. He understood the holidays they haunted. He knew that the magic of Halloween wasn't just about the jump scares. It was about the crisp autumn air, the glowing jack-o'-lanterns, the shared communal ritual of being scared together. He understood the spirit of the season, and he believed that Christmas had a dark spirit of its own, one that had been buried under a mountain of tinsel and fake snow for far too long. Christmas horror wasn't a new idea, of course. The genre had been lurking in the shadows for decades. You had the gritty, controversial slasher films like Black Christmas and Silent Night, Deadly Night, which treated the holiday as a grim, ironic backdrop for murder. Then you had the creature features, most famously Joe Dante's Gremlins. And it's Gremlins that really provides the tonal blueprint for what Doherty was about to attempt. That film masterfully blended genuine scares, mischievous fun, and a deep, almost satirical love for the Christmas season itself. It proved you could make a Christmas movie that was also a monster movie, without betraying either genre. Doherty wanted to do for Christmas what he had done for Halloween. He wanted to create a film that felt like a modern dark fairy tale. A cautionary tale for an age that had lost its way. An age drowning in commercialism and cynical family arguments. His monster couldn't just be a mindless slasher in a Santa suit. He needed a villain with a purpose, a mythology. He needed a monster with a point of view. He needed Krampus. The film, simply titled Krampus, centers on the Engel family. They are the quintessential modern American family, which is to say they're a complete mess. The parents are drifting apart, the kids are cynical, and the visiting relatives are a collection of boorish caricatures who would rather argue about politics than share a moment of genuine connection. The young son, Max, is the only one who still believes in the magic of Christmas. He writes a heartfelt letter to Santa, but after a brutal fight with his cousins, he tears it up in a fit of rage and throws the pieces out into the wind. It's a powerful symbolic act. He isn't just tearing up a letter. He's renouncing hope. He's surrendering to the bitterness and cynicism that has infected his family. And in doing so, he performs an accidental invocation. He has extinguished the last ember of Christmas spirit, and in the suffocating darkness that remains, something ancient is stirred. A blizzard descends, cutting the family off from the world. And then the hunt begins. What Doherty and his team at Weta Workshop, the same geniuses who brought Middle-earth to life, understood is that Krampus himself should be the main event, the final boss. His arrival had to be earned, so first he sends his minions. And this is where the film's twisted genius truly shines. Krampus doesn't work alone. He brings with him a perverted legion of Christmas icons. A cherubic angel treetopper becomes a shrieking harpy. A beloved jack-in-the-box uncoils into a serpentine, flesh-eating clown worm. Gingerbread men, armed with a nail gun, become cackling, murderous commandos. Each of these creations is a masterpiece of dark fantasy, brought to life with stunning practical effects that give them a weight and reality that CGI so often lacks. They feel like things that have crawled out of a dusty, cursed attic. The film becomes a siege movie, a twisted version of Home Alone, where the family isn't fighting off bumbling burglars, but a relentless army of Yuletide demons. And through it all, we only get glimpses of their master. A heavy, cloven hoofprint in the snow, a hulking, horned shadow moving across the rooftops, the sound of heavy chains dragging through the attic. Doherty builds the tension masterfully, making the audience wait, making them dread the final reveal. When Krampus finally appears, it's a showstopper. This isn't the slightly comical, lolling-tongued devil from the Krampusgarten. This is a terrifying, primordial force of nature. He is immense, towering over the house, his horns like the gnarled branches of a dead winter tree. His face is hidden behind a serene, almost human-like mask, but the mask is cracked and ancient, hiding something truly monstrous beneath. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. He is the silent, wrathful embodiment of a forgotten tradition. He is the shadow that St. Nicholas casts. The film's brilliance lies in its central theme. Krampus is not punishing the family for being naughty in the traditional sense, for lying or stealing. He is punishing them for a far greater sin, losing hope, for giving up on each other, for letting the spirit of Christmas die. In this version of the myth, Krampus isn't just a bogeyman for children. He is a judge for all of humanity. He comes when the light of belief goes out. He is the consequence of cynicism. The movie was a surprise hit. It resonated with audiences who were tired of the saccharine, repetitive nature of modern Christmas entertainment. It was scary, it was funny, and most importantly, it was original. It took a piece of obscure folklore and turned it into a new holiday classic. Suddenly, everyone knew who Krampus was. He was no longer a regional alpine tradition or a punchline on a sitcom. He was a certified A-list movie monster, standing shoulder to shoulder with Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. The film's release was a cultural detonation. The Krampus legend went from a slow burn to a wildfire. Krampus-themed parties, Krampus sweaters, Krampus costumes at Comic-Con, haunted houses, which normally lie dormant after Halloween, suddenly had a new winter season, with Krampus as the star attraction. Universal Studios' Halloween Horror Nights added a massively popular Krampus maze. He was on merchandise, in video games, and in a flood of low-budget copycat films trying to cash in on the phenomenon. The 2015 film was The Coronation. It took all the disparate elements of the Krampus myth, the horns, the chains, the tongue, the basket, the birch rods, and forged them into a single, definitive, and terrifyingly cool image. It gave him a Hollywood makeover, sanding down the stranger, more esoteric edges of the folklore to create a monster that a global audience could understand and, more importantly, buy a ticket to see. Michael Dougherty's film had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. It had taken the Christmas devil out of the history books and placed him firmly onto the pop culture throne. But this mainstream success came at a price. In translating the myth for mass consumption, certain things were inevitably lost. The complex relationship with St. Nicholas, the specific traditions of the Krampuslauf, the deep-seated cultural roots in the Alpine villages, all of it was streamlined into a more universal monster punishes bad people narrative. Krampus was now a global brand. But as his fame reached its absolute peak, a fascinating question began to emerge. By becoming a monster for everyone, had he stopped belonging to anyone? This question of ownership is at the very heart of the modern Krampus story. Because as Krampus went from Alpine legend to internet meme to Hollywood movie star, something fundamental began to shift. The creature that stalked American movie screens in 2015 wasn't quite the same one that roamed the villages of Austria. The Hollywood Krampus was a beast of pure punishment, a CGI-heavy monster designed for jump scares and box office returns. He was, for all intents and purposes, a generic Christmas demon. He had the horns, the tongue, the chains, but he was missing his soul. In the United States and other parts of the world, Krampus became a product. He was an edgy alternative to the saccharine sweetness of mainstream Christmas. He was the face on an ugly Christmas sweater, the theme for a trendy pop-up bar, the villain in a horror movie. He was cool. He was counterculture. But in this process of commercialization, his context was stripped away. He was unmoored from the specific valleys, the specific villages, and the specific traditions that had given him life for centuries. He became a symbol without a story, a monster without a home. And back in the Alps, people noticed. This explosion of global interest was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought a surge of tourism. Suddenly, people from all over the world wanted to fly to Austria or Bavaria to witness a real Krampuslauf, a Krampus run. Local artisans who spent months hand-carving the intricate, terrifying wooden masks, known as larvae, found a new international market for their craft. The traditions were getting worldwide attention, which many saw as a source of immense pride. But on the other hand, there was a growing sense of unease. Was this global phenomenon diluting their culture? Was their ancient, chaotic, and deeply meaningful ritual being turned into a tourist spectacle? A performance for Instagram? Purists argued that the Americanized Krampus was a caricature, a cheap knockoff that missed the entire point. They saw a tradition that was deeply tied to the changing of the seasons, to the community, and to a complex dance between good and evil, being flattened into a simple, scary Santa narrative. To understand their perspective, you have to understand what a real Krampuslauf is actually like. It is nothing like a horror movie. It's something far more primal, more chaotic, and more alive. Imagine a cold December night in a small alpine town. The air is sharp with the smell of pine, roasting chestnuts, and something else. Something acrid. Smoke. The streets are lined with people, their breath fogging in the frosty air. There's an anxious energy, a mix of fear and excitement. Children are held tight by their parents. Then you hear it. A distant, discordant clanging. It's not the gentle jingle of sleigh bells. It's a heavy, rhythmic, metallic roar. The sound of cowbells, not worn by cows but by demons. The sound grows louder, more menacing, echoing off the ancient stone buildings. It's a sound designed to instill primal fear. Out of the darkness and smoke they emerge. Not one Krampus but dozens. A troupe known as a pass. These are not men in cheap Halloween costumes. Each Krampus is a work of folk art and raw intimidation. They are massive, covered in shaggy goat or sheep pelts. Strapped to their backs are those enormous, deafening bells that clang with every powerful step. But it's the masks, the larvae, that truly capture the horror. Hand-carved from wood, each one is unique. They have snarling mouths filled with vicious fangs, dead eyes, and colossal, twisting horns that reach for the sky. These aren't just masks. They are believed by some to be vessels. When a young man puts on the mask and the heavy costume, a transformation is said to occur. He doesn't just play Krampus. For a time he becomes him. The pass moves through the crowd like a force of nature. It is pure controlled chaos. The Krampuses roar, they snarl, they charge into the crowds, rattling their chains. They carry bundles of birch branches, and they are not just for show. They whip the legs of onlookers, especially the young men who are brave or foolish enough to stand their ground. It's not malicious, not truly. It's ritualistic. It's a dare. It's a way of confronting the darkness, of looking it in the eye and not flinching. And crucially, Krampus is not alone. Leading the procession is Saint Nicholas himself, calm, benevolent, a figure of pure light amidst the demonic chaos. He is the counterbalance. He represents order, grace, and the sacred. With him are often angelic figures, who hand out sweets to the well-behaved children hiding behind their parents. This is the part the Hollywood movies always leave out. Krampus is not the main event. He is part of a larger cosmic play. He is the darkness that makes the light of St. Nicholas shine that much brighter. He is the wild, untamed pagan spirit being led and controlled by Christian order. The entire spectacle is a story, a living folktale playing out in the streets. It's about the balance between good and evil, chaos and order, fear and faith. The purpose of the Krampuslauf isn't just to scare children into being good. It's a form of community catharsis. It's a way to symbolically drive out the evils and darkness of the old year before the quiet, contemplative Christmas season begins. For the young men in the costumes, it's a rite of passage, a physically demanding and spiritually intense experience that binds them to their heritage and to each other. It's loud, it's violent, it's terrifying, and it's deeply, profoundly communal. So when someone from one of these villages sees Krampus on a t-shirt at a mall in Ohio, reduced to a cartoon devil with the caption, "He knows when you've been bad," you can understand why they might feel that something precious has been lost in translation. But here's the final fascinating twist in this story of authenticity. Even within the Alps, the tradition itself is changing. The global spotlight has had an undeniable effect. What were once spontaneous, genuinely chaotic village events have become more organized, ticketed festivals designed to handle thousands of tourists. Safety regulations have been put in place. The unwritten rules of the past, don't hit people above the knees, leave the elderly and small children alone, have become formal enforced policies. Some runs have even set up barricades to separate the performers from the audience, turning a participatory ritual into a spectator sport. The raw, unpredictable danger that was once a key part of the experience is being tamed. The wild spirit is being put in a cage, not by outsiders, but by the very communities trying to preserve it. They are caught in a paradox. To save their tradition in the modern world, they must change it, and in changing it, they risk losing the very thing that made it so powerful in the first place. The authentic Krampus, it seems, is becoming just as elusive in his homeland as he is abroad. And so, if the authentic Krampus is fading in the old world, where has his spirit gone? The answer, it seems, is that it did what so many ambitious, misunderstood figures have done throughout history. It packed its chains, its bundle of birch sticks, and it came to America. For decades, Krampus was little more than a piece of obscure European trivia in the United States, a strange-looking character on antique postcards shared by contrarians online. He was a footnote in the story of Christmas, a weird cousin nobody talked about. But then, sometime in the early 2000s and exploding in the 2010s, something shifted. The beast was unleashed. Suddenly, Krampus was everywhere. He was the star of his own Hollywood horror film. He was showing up in episodes of television shows from Supernatural to American Dad. Cities across the country, from Los Angeles to Philadelphia, started hosting their own Krampuslauf parades, or Krampusnacht parties. He was on ugly Christmas sweaters, craft beer labels, and heavy metal album covers. The Christmas Devil had, against all odds, become a pop culture icon. And this raises the most fascinating question of all. Why? Why now? Why did this ancient alpine demon suddenly find such a welcoming home in the modern American consciousness? The answer, I believe, is that we didn't just import Krampus, we needed him. He arrived at a moment when our own version of Christmas was beginning to feel hollow. For generations, the American Christmas has been subjected to a relentless process of sanding and polishing. Every sharp edge has been smoothed over, every dark corner illuminated. The holiday has become a 2-month-long festival of uncomplicated joy, a commercialized behemoth of mandatory happiness, driven by a narrative of universal goodness where every child is, by default, on the nice list. The worst punishment imaginable has devolved from a bundle of switches and a trip to hell, to maybe getting a video game for the wrong console. Into this landscape of saccharine sweetness and performative cheer, Krampus stomps in like a blast of icy mountain air. He is the antidote to the forced smile. He is the punk rock rebellion against the tyranny of sentimental Christmas carols. He represents a kind of primal honesty that our modern holiday has lost. He reminds us that the world isn't all sugar plums and silver bells, that there are consequences, that there is a darkness that balances the light. He is, in a way, the patron saint of bah humbug, a validation for everyone who feels a little overwhelmed by the pressure to be perpetually merry and bright. But it goes even deeper than that. Psychologically, Krampus fills a profound void left in the modern Christmas story. The great psychologist Carl Jung spoke of the shadow self, the part of our psyche that contains all the impulses, desires, and fears we repress and hide away. For a story or a myth to feel whole and resonant, it needs to acknowledge the shadow. Saint Nicholas, in his modern Coca-Cola-sponsored form, is all light. He is pure benevolence, a grandfatherly figure of unconditional giving. He has no edge, no threat. But without a shadow, the light loses its meaning. Without the risk of punishment, does the reward truly feel earned? Krampus is the shadow of Santa Claus. He is the missing half of the equation. He reintroduces the concept of a balanced moral universe. He doesn't just punish the naughty. By his very existence, he makes being nice a conscious choice rather than a passive default. He gives the story teeth. He restores the dramatic tension. We are drawn to him because some ancient primal part of us understands that a celebration of pure, unadulterated light feels incomplete, even dishonest. We need the darkness to appreciate the warmth of the fire. We need the threat of the beast to truly value the protection of the saint. There's a third reason for his rise, and it's one of authenticity. In an age of plastic trees made in factories and disposable decorations, Krampus feels ancient, earthy, and real. He smells of pine and fir and soot, not cinnamon-scented air freshener. His origins are not in a marketing department, but in the murky depths of pre-Christian folklore. He is a direct link to a time when winter was a genuinely dangerous and terrifying season, not just an excuse to sell peppermint mochas. When we see his carved wooden mask and hear the clang of his rusty chains, we feel a connection to something deeper, something more elemental than the latest Black Friday deal. We're not just adopting a monster. We're trying to reclaim a piece of a wilder, more authentic past in the face of an increasingly sterile and commercialized present. But here lies the great ironic twist in the American story of Krampus. In our search for his authenticity, we have inevitably begun to change him, to domesticate the beast. Just as the Austrians are wrestling with how to present him to tourists, we in America have been reshaping him to fit our own cultural narratives. In his homeland, he is a companion to Saint Nicholas, a part of a duo, a moral enforcer within an established system. In America, he is most often a solo act. He is the star of his own show. We've untethered him from the saint and turned him into a standalone monster, a horror movie villain, or a dark anti-hero. He has become less a figure of moral reckoning and more a creature of pure chaos, a seasonal slasher who exists for our entertainment. We put his face on a kitschy sweater and we laugh. We turn him into the villain of a comedy horror film, and we eat popcorn. We have taken this terrifying embodiment of winter's wrath, this very real folkloric threat, meant to scare children into good behavior, and we have made him safe. We've made him into merchandise. The very process of embracing him to escape the commercialism of Christmas has turned him into another product to be bought and sold. And so we are faced with a fascinating paradox. We summoned Krampus across the ocean because we craved his darkness, his danger, his authenticity. But the moment he arrived on our shores, we began to file down his horns and polish his chains. We put him in a cage of pop culture, turning him into another spectacle to be consumed. The question then becomes, what happens to a demon when he's been tamed? What happens to a shadow when you drag it out into the floodlights of Hollywood and the commercial marketplace? We wanted the real Krampus, but we have perhaps inevitably created an American one, a beast remade in our own image. This new creature, this American Krampus, reflects our own anxieties, our own desires, our own complicated relationship with the very holiday he haunts. He is both a symbol of rebellion against the modern Christmas and increasingly a symptom of it. He is a monster, a meme, a marketing tool, and a mirror. And what we see reflected back in his demonic eyes tells us less about ancient Alpine folklore and more about who we are right now. The story of Krampus is no longer just about punishing naughty children. It's now about a culture trying to figure out what it believes in and what it's truly afraid of. To understand his final, ultimate purpose, we have to look past the masks and the movies and ask what this ancient devil is really trying to teach us here in the 21st century. To understand his final, ultimate purpose, we have to look past the masks and the movies and ask what this ancient devil is really trying to teach us here in the 21st century. The answer, it seems, is that Krampus is a mirror. And what he reflects back at us is deeply uncomfortable, but absolutely necessary. For centuries, the Christmas story, at least in its popular form, has been a story of light. It's about goodness rewarded, about comfort and joy, about a benevolent, grandfatherly figure who brings gifts to the deserving. Santa Claus is the ultimate symbol of uncomplicated, positive reinforcement. He is order. He is predictability. Be good, and good things will come to you. But reality is never that simple, is it? Life has shadows. Actions have consequences. And for every force of pure light, there must be an equal and opposite force of darkness to maintain the balance. Krampus is that balance. He is the chaos to Santa's order. He is the consequence to Santa's reward. He isn't evil in the way we might think of a biblical devil, seeking to corrupt souls. He is a force of nature, a principle of cosmic justice. He is the living embodiment of the idea that your choices matter, and that sometimes the outcome isn't a lump of coal, but something far more terrifying. In our modern, hyper-commercialized world, this role has become more important than ever. Christmas has been sanitized, shrink-wrapped, and sold to us as a season of mandatory happiness and relentless consumption. The pressure to be joyful, to buy the perfect gifts, to create the perfect family memory, is immense. It's a version of the holiday that leaves little room for anything messy, complicated, or real. It leaves little room for the darkness that many people feel during the coldest, bleakest time of the year. And into this polished, perfect department store holiday, Krampus stomps in, covered in soot and smelling of the wild. He cannot be commercialized. You can't make a cute, cuddly Krampus plush toy that captures his essence. You can't put his face on a soda can and have it mean the same thing. He is inherently disruptive. He is the punk rock rebellion against a saccharine pop song. He reminds us that this season has roots that go far deeper than shopping malls and television specials. It has ancient, pagan roots tied to the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. A time when our ancestors huddled together, genuinely afraid of the cold and the dark, and told stories of the monsters that lurked within it. Krampus is a connection to that primal, authentic past. He is a taste of the wild in our domesticated world. This might explain the explosion of the Krampuslauf, the Krampus run, in cities across America. People don't just want to watch a movie about him anymore. They want to experience him. They want to see the carved wooden masks, hear the clanging of the cowbells, feel the genuine jolt of fear as a figure from their deepest nightmares lurches out of the crowd. Why? Because it's a form of catharsis. It is a communal release of tension. In a world of abstract anxieties, the economy, politics, the environment, Krampus provides a concrete, tangible thing to be afraid of. You can see him, you can hear him, you can run from him. And when the parade is over, the fear is gone. It's a way to confront the darkness on our own terms, to scream and laugh and feel alive. It's a ritual that allows us to process our fears together, as a community, and then banish them for another year. But his most profound lesson might be about morality itself. We tell children that Santa is making a list and checking it twice. It's a system of surveillance and transactional goodness. It teaches that the reason to be good is to get stuff. It's a child's version of morality, simple and effective. Krampus, however, offers a more adult, more terrifyingly honest version. He doesn't care about a list. He is the direct, physical manifestation of wrongdoing. He doesn't just withhold a gift. He administers a punishment that fits the crime. He represents accountability. In a world where it can often feel like the wealthy, the powerful, and the corrupt escape the consequences of their actions, the idea of a creature who shows up specifically to hold the naughty accountable is incredibly appealing. He is a folk justice warrior. He doesn't listen to excuses. He doesn't care about your intentions. He sees the bad deeds and he acts. He forces us to look at the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. Our selfishness, our greed, our cruelty. He is our shadow self, given horns and a long pointed tongue. And the story of Krampus tells us that we can't just ignore that shadow. We have to confront it, or it will drag us away in the night. So, is Krampus a monster? Yes. Is he a devil? In a sense. But he is not the enemy of Christmas. In many ways, he is its savior. He saves it from becoming a hollow, commercialized shell of itself. He saves it from its own unbearable lightness. He reminds us that bravery means nothing without fear, that warmth means nothing without the cold, and that the true light of the season only shines so brightly because of the profound darkness that surrounds it. He is the shiver down our spine that makes the fire feel warmer. He is the frightening story that makes us hold our loved ones a little tighter. He is the ancient, wild spirit that reminds us that the world is not always safe or fair, and that our choices have a terrifying weight. He doesn't want to steal our presence. He wants to give us a gift of his own, the chilling, thrilling, and absolutely vital understanding that to be good is not just a means to an end. It is a choice we must make every single day, in the face of the darkness, both outside our door and within our own hearts. The chains he rattles are not just for naughty children. They are a warning for us all. A clanking reminder that the shadow is always there, watching, waiting, and balancing the scales.